Okie dokie. Let's go. This is going to be fun. So, my name's Ryan. I am the owner and head roaster here at Longshot. And today, I want to let's spend a little while talking about how to make excellent tasting espresso. We all know that every drink that we serve in the cafe has an espresso in its base. Cappuccinos, mochas, whatever, they all have an espresso in them. And so if your espresso is no good, then the rest of the drink is going to be trying to make up for the lack of the quality of the espresso that you make. And there are levels to espresso. If you can hear that noise in the background, I'm really sorry. The factory is very close to an airport, so I'm doing my best. So it is really important that we make great tasting espresso. You already understand this. And there's two things that I want to cover off today. First of all, I want to teach you how to dial in. Dialing in is the process of setting a recipe for your espresso so that it tastes great. So dialing in is one thing I want to cover today, but I also want to cover some of the technique of brewing espresso. Now it's pretty easy. Brewing espresso is pretty easy once you know the recipe, and once you have focused on your technique a little bit, there's a good chance that your espresso will taste great. So recipe, technique, and then lastly, we'll touch on some stuff with troubleshooting, because sometimes it's hard to know what's going wrong with our espresso, why it tastes the way that it does. So, we're going to start with technique, I think. Technique is probably a good place to start. If we don't have good technique, then it really doesn't matter how your espresso machine is dialed in. So, we are going to use a set of scales to control our brew. So you'll notice that I have a set of scales over here on the bar, and we're going to use that to measure the coffee that comes out of the grinder and the espresso that comes out of the machine. So a set of scales can really help you paint by numbers. Back in the day, the coffee industry has focused on measuring our espresso and the way that our coffee brews kind of by sight. If you've ever heard somebody say, you need to stop the shot when it is blonding, well, it's really hard to understand when blonding occurs. So I prefer to paint by numbers. I would like some defined rules around what my espresso should be. So that's why we use a set of scales. Now, let's get started into our techniques. The first thing you'll notice is I have taken my portafilter out of the espresso machine and then flushed some water out of the head. Now that's because coffee granules get stuck to the shower screen up inside of the espresso machine. So flushing a little bit of water is going to flush those granules away. It's also going to help reduce the chance of you getting any buildup of calcium or any other kind of any other compounds that could make your espresso machine jam up. Yeah? So flushing a bit of water through is a good idea. It also helps actually with temperature stability. On espresso machines that only have one single boiler, flushing a bit of water through is going to help stabilize the temperature of that head. If your espresso machine has been sitting for a long time, then your brew head is going to be very, very hot. Adding a little bit of slightly cooler water through it is going to cool it down a little bit. Cool. So, we've taken the handle out and we're going to bang it into our knock bin. And I'm going to take this and we're going to clean this out. We need our baskets to be clean and dry. You don't want grubby baskets. Nice and clean. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. Cool. Right. So now we're going to use a set of scales to weigh out our coffee. This is going to be a little bit more obvious in a minute when we start talking about our recipe, but that is what we are using. We're using a set of scales. No, you don't need to use a set of scales for every single shot that you brew, but it is a very, very, very good tool for getting some consistency in the way that your drinks are made. Whoop. Okay, I've tared my set of scales to 0. I have my portafilter sitting on top of my scales. I don't know if you can see it down here. Cool. Now, we're going to add 20 grams of coffee to the basket. This is an industry standard. This is an industry standard recipe for brewing espresso. 20 grams of coffee going in the basket and giving us 40 grams of espresso. Sometimes I get those numbers mixed up, and sometimes I'll say the wrong thing at the wrong time, but I'm making a concerted effort right now. 20 grams in the basket, 40 grams of espresso, should take 30 seconds to brew. This is our basic recipe. If I say anything different to that, it's a mistake. Don't listen to it. Okay, so we have 20 grams in the basket. Now, it's important, we're talking about the technique stuff, okay? So we've added our coffee to the basket. Different coffee grinders will make our coffee grind different consistencies. The higher quality your grinder is and the sharper your burrs are, the fluffier your grind will be. This is important because we need to have our coffee grind to be clump-free. Clumpy bits in our basket are going to lead to a thing called channeling. And we'll talk a little bit more about channeling later on, but for now you should understand that we want this to be as even as possible. Now there's a couple of different techniques that I like to use to make sure that the coffee in the basket is even. Now if you're sitting there and you're like, this seems like an excessive amount of focus on what's going on in the basket, you're right, it is excessive, but it's important because what happens in the basket, this process that I'm teaching you now, this technique, this is called puck preparation, and it is vital for making great tasting espresso. Espresso is really a hard drink to make. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, and it often will taste bad. And if we do things like puck preparation and use a good recipe, then we're going to get great tasting espresso. So I like to use the sort of meaty part of my hand to tap on the basket to even it out. My goal here is to knock any fragments of coffee and even each of these little granules so that they're all packed in there nice and neatly. This is a bit different to tamping, which we're going to touch on in a second, but it's important to tap because that's going to shift the coffee laterally, sliding it from side to side so that it fills any cracks or grooves. This is important for getting really great water flow through our coffee bed. So using your hand and tapping it on the side, that's the free way. That doesn't require any equipment and it takes basically no time to do. You can also use a thing called a WDT, a Weiss distribution tool. And I don't know if my camera is going to pick it up. I don't know if you'll be able to see the little needles. This has got a bunch of little needles. These needles are actually the ones that you use for making tattoos. These are from a tattoo gun. And I sell these things. These are these WDT rakes. I sell these. But you can add that to your basket to break up the clumps. Is this excessive? Absolutely it is. You don't need to do this every time. But I'm explaining to you a technique at least so that you know about it and you can make the choice on whether or not you use it behind the bar or not. I'm at the roastery. I basically only make coffee for myself and I use this every single time. In a production, like in a fast-paced cafe, probably not going to be viable. There are automated versions of a rake. Cool. So if you're not going to use a rake, at least use the fat, meaty part of your hand to even that bed out. Our goal is to make sure that there are no cracks, no fissures, no paths of least resistance that the water is going to work its way through. Cool. All right. So we have a really nice fluffy bed with no fragments, with no fractures in it. Now comes tamping. Tamping is really important, and we need to do this very carefully. Remember, we're still talking about the techniques. So the technique one is distribution. That's how we put the coffee grind in the basket. Technique two is tamping. Now, it is important to get this tamper perpendicular in the basket. It needs to be straight from all angles. Basically, we can't squish more of this coffee. We can't squish some areas of this coffee more than other areas. Yeah? If our tamp is uneven, then our water flow is going to prefer the less tamped side because it's going to be softer. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can tamp. There's a bunch of different ways that you can tamp. Here's how I do it. I put the Let's put this down. I put the fat part of the tamper in the palm of my hand. I wrap my pinky, my ring finger, and my middle finger. I wrap them around the base like this. And I have my forefinger and my thumb on the edge. And if we look closely, I can see that my thumb and my forefinger are in about the same spot. So when I press this into the basket, I'm going to be able to feel the edge of the basket with my fingers. It's not because I'm necessarily testing a depth. Again, I'm sorry if that's very loud. It's not because I'm testing a depth, but because we need to assess whether we are even. And having our fingers on the side will help us feel if there is an uneven side, a side that we are leaning towards most. So I have it like this. Then we flip the tamper upside down and we try to draw a straight line of pressure from our elbow through our wrist and directly into the tamp. That is the important thing to think about. I really don't encourage tamping like this if I stand side on, tamping like this. We have a tendency when we tamp this way to press forward on the tamper. I don't know if you can see that. Press forward into our coffee. And we really don't want to do that. Also, I notice if I do it this way, it might be different for you, but I can get quite a sore wrist if I have to do this a lot. That's why I adopt this style. So it's a straight line, and all I have to do is just lock those joints up, and then the pressure is relatively easy. So we know that we need to be straight in the portafilter from all angles. And the way that I do this is I put the portafilter on a table. I don't know if you can see that. Let me just move you down a little bit. We'll zoom out a little bit. I just spilt the coffee. Let's try that again. Cool. 20 grams in the basket. My grinder has given me 22, so I'm going to get rid of those 2 grams. And we can talk about programming your grinder in a little bit. Cool. We're going to distribute, and then we're going to tamp. So I put the portafilter on the table, on the table here, and draw a line directly from my wrist into the basket. Now, we all know that it needs to be straight in the basket, like this, even on all sides. If you were to look at it from side on, there should be the same height around the edge of the tamper the whole way around. Yep, that makes sense. That's really obvious. However, a lot of people think that you need to achieve this by having the portafilter perpendicular to the floor. Nowhere in the rule book did it say that this has to be parallel to the floor. So you can change the angle of the portafilter on the table. Whatever the angle needs to be for you to be able to draw a straight line into it comfortably. I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well here. Let me try that again. So for me, to get on this table, because of the length of my legs, the length of my arms, the height of my hips, all of that stuff, for me to get a comfortable, even tamp, I kind of tamp it on an angle like this. It's not perfectly parallel with the floor like this. I actually have it on an angle so that I can tamp carefully, because if we're going to tamp, let's say 100 times a day, you can actually do a little bit of damage to the joints in your wrist and your shoulder and the rest of your posture in your body. So for me, I'm very mindful of tamping in a way that I could tamp like this all day long. I also don't use stacks of pressure. We don't need stacks of pressure just to squish that coffee and push out any air that's sort of in between all of the coffee granules. That's all we're trying to do. We're not trying to change the density. We're just trying to squeeze out any air, compress any clumps, squeeze it to make it as homogeneous and as even as possible. That's what we're trying to do. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So we're moving on. Tamp evenly. It needs to be a straight line. Use your thumb as a gauge, your thumb and your forefinger. Actually, you can press into your basket, and then if you do a really gentle rotation, Like back the pressure off, don't keep pressing in, back the pressure off and just gently rotate the tamp. You'll be able to feel if it's uneven. You'll be able to feel one side if it's higher than the other. That's how I tamp. So, what have we achieved? What have we achieved so far? We now have this beautiful, homogeneous bed of coffee granule fragments. That's pretty cool. What that means is that when we turn the pump pressure on from our espresso machine, it is going to deliver an even pressure into our coffee granules, and each little fragment is going to get exposed to the same amount of water flow. This is our ultimate goal for brewing coffee of any sort. Every fragment, even contact with water. This is basic stuff. So, now that we've done all this work, I regularly see a barista take their portafilter with all of this work done and they go do that. They smack it into the espresso machine. Well, what that's going to do is that's going to fracture this coffee bed. It's going to break it apart. And it's going to open a great big gap for the water to flow straight through and give us an uneven tasting brew. We're going to get bitterness and sourness out of our drink at the same time. It's a pretty unpleasant kind of experience. So now that we've gone and put all this effort into making our espresso, we're going to clean any coffee fragments off the lugs here so we don't push them into the espresso machine. And then we're going to gently insert our portafilter into the espresso machine, cool as a cucumber. This is important. If we smack it around, we're going to undo all of the work, all of the distribution, all of the tamping, all of that puck preparation for no reason. So we're going to very gently put it into the espresso machine. And here is a bit of a myth. There's a bit of a myth here that if you don't start the espresso machine straight away, you're going to burn the coffee. And that is not true. It's not real. Not a real thing. Honestly, burnt flavors like actual carbon, that comes from the roasting machine. That's just over there. Carbon flavors in your coffee, that comes from poor roasting. It doesn't come from the espresso machine. So leaving this here, we can actually see, I don't know if you can see that, but there's not even any water on our coffee bed. It hasn't even touched the espresso machine because there is a gap. So we have this in the espresso machine. Now, I use a set of scales to measure the amount of espresso I make too. Like I said, I am just making coffee for myself here at the roastery. I am making coffee to do quality control of the batches I roast, so I'm under no time pressure. However, you can absolutely program your espresso machine, which I encourage you to learn how to do. You can program your espresso machine to make sure that it delivers the same amount of water. And we can talk about this in a little bit when we talk about programming. So we have now followed the techniques. We've put the coffee in the basket. We've made sure that it's not very clumpy. We've tamped it very carefully. All of the fragments are nice and even. We have put it into the espresso machine gently so as not to make any fractures. And now we can start brewing. Like I said, I use a set of scales to help me control this process. I'm going to tear my cup to 0. I'm going to use a timer. We all have one. It's on our phone. And I am brewing. I am expecting 40 grams of espresso in 30 seconds. And I'll talk a little bit more about dialing in a second. But this is a basic recipe. And can you break the rules around this recipe? Yeah, absolutely you can. However, this is the recipe that I use to do quality control on all of the roasts here at the roastery. So if you stray outside of that rules, outside of that recipe, which you are absolutely entitled to do if you think that it tastes good, just know that it's a bit different to how I intended it to be brewed. There is nothing wrong with that, but you're at least aware of that now that I've explained it. So, I got 40 grams of espresso. You can't see it, but the little set of scales reads 40 grams here, and that took 35 seconds to brew. So it's brewed a little bit longer than I was expecting, but that's okay because we can correct for that in a minute. So does that make sense? We have very gently, very carefully distributed coffee. Actually, we'll start at the beginning. We knocked the coffee out of the basket. and we flushed our head. We added 20 grams of coffee to the basket. We distributed them evenly. We fluffed them with a WDT tool if we have one and if we have time for it. We tamped very evenly and then we put it into the espresso machine carefully. And that whole process gave us a drink that weighed 40 grams and it took 30 seconds to brew. That is, or in my case, 35 seconds to brew. That is a, basically, perfect espresso. That is perfect. There is not much else that I can talk about in terms of how to improve the way that this brewed. There's a couple of things that we could check. We could check the temperature of our brew water, which I'm using 94 degrees here. But beyond that, there's not a lot more. We would be really nitpicking. So if you are brewing coffee like this and it's coming out like this, then you are doing such an amazing job. That's a hard thing to do. Excellent. We have made some great tasting espresso. When it comes to drinking espresso, and I encourage you all to drink it, let it cool down a little bit. Let your espresso cool down a bit. It will be very, very strong. If you don't like drinking espresso, do try drinking your coffee black by diluting it with some water. And let it cool down and then really try to understand its flavor, understand what's going on. If it's really bitter, we can adjust for that. If it's really sour tasting, we can adjust for that. Yum. Yum, yum, yum. Excellent. That's yum. So, let me turn you a little bit more towards the grinder. I'm going to drag you in and we will talk a little bit more about dialing our coffee in. So come on over. If I can drag you on this little tripod here, we'll zoom you in. Okay. Cool. How much of me can you see? Not a lot. Okay, let's fix that then. Okay. Cool. Right. So let's talk about dialing in. Dialing in is the process of controlling how this brewed. Now remember how I said it took 35 seconds to brew instead of my goal of 30? Well, how do we fix that? There are three things that we need to control when we are dialing in. So we've moved beyond the very basics of just the technique of brewing espresso, and now we're starting to try to control our equipment with a little bit more professionalism, let's call it. So the first thing we need to focus on is our dose. Very, very simply, our dose is the amount of coffee that we put in the basket. Like I said, an industry standard dose is 20 grams. So that's the first thing that we need to sort of lock in. We can change the amount of water that flows out of our espresso machine, and we can change the grind size of our coffee fragments. We can change them, but we're not going to change our dose. That dose is not going to change. So we are going to continuously now, for the rest of the way that we think about coffee, we are going to continuously think about a consistent dose. If our dose changes, then the whole brew process sort of hinges on that. Just to give you some kind of idea, let's say we start the day with 20 grams of coffee in the basket. And as it heats up, as our grinder heats up, because we are brewing coffee, creating friction, all of the metal is shifting and changing because it's heating. All of a sudden, we notice that our shots are going faster. We don't know why, but we remember that Ryan told us when our shots go fast, we need to grind finer. And so we grind finer. But our shots get faster and faster and faster. Now the problem here is what actually happened was our dose went down. If our dose goes down, our shots will get faster. That makes sense, right? Because we've got less coffee in the basket. So if we're not using a set of scales to control this, we can start trying to correct our espresso with the wrong approach. By having a set of scales here to double check your work is vital. You can buy them from me. All wholesale customers have access to buying a set of scales. These ones, actually. These are the ones I use. They're cheap. They're cheap. El cheapies. These are the ones that are great. You can absolutely get some really nice scales for your bar. I encourage people to do that, but if you just don't know if a set of scales is going to be useful for your business, you can get these ones. They're called Rhino Ware scales. Cool. So we're going to add 20 grams of coffee to the basket. And when we're dialing in, we're going to do this manually. Now, everybody's coffee grinder is a little bit different, but for now, for the process of, whoop, I did just lose you for a second. You still here? Yeah, cool. Sorry about that. So we're going to start by grinding manually to start, and then we're going to program the grinder a little bit later. So for the sake of being manual, we're going to add 20 grams of coffee to the basket manually. Cool. Great. We've got 20 grams of coffee in the basket. So now that we have this, we can program our grind size. This is really cool. We can now start to muck around with our grind size to change how our coffee tastes. Now, our dose and our yield is the amount of espresso that our process produces. Our dose and our yield. Our dose is 20 grams, our yield is 40 grams. And you'll notice that I'm not talking about using mils to measure our espresso. Lots and lots and lots of people do use mils, but it's a pretty inaccurate measure for what's going on. And you might say, well, that doesn't really matter. Accuracy isn't important. Yeah, I get it. I understand that you think that it doesn't really matter, a couple of mils here or a couple of mils there, but everything I'm trying to teach you is in the pursuit of making a great experience for our customers. That's what we all want at the end of the day. When a customer comes in and they get a latte, it should be great. When they come in tomorrow and there's a different person on the machine, should still be great. So using a set of scales and to measure both of our dry coffee and the liquid coffee is going to make the process so much more accurate. So the challenge with using mils or volume, a volume measurement, the challenge of using mils is that we have crema on our coffee. And as our coffee sits, the crema dissipates. It's a foam, yeah? It's got little bubbles. The bubbles pop, the foam breaks down. So the amount of liquid or the amount of space that an espresso takes up changes over time. As our coffee ages, it has less carbon dioxide in it, which means that it's going to produce less crema. So that means if you wanted to be really accurate with your volume, you would need to have like a different amount of coffee in the basket, in the jug, depending on how long ago the coffee was roasted. It's very inaccurate and it's going to cause you all kinds of trouble. So just use a set of scales to measure the liquid. That way, it doesn't really matter how much crema is on top of our drink because it's going to evaporate. It doesn't weigh anything. So using a set of scales will help us get more accuracy. And it's also a lot easier to teach somebody. It's a lot easier to teach somebody to put 20 grams of coffee in the basket and 40 grams of liquid into the cup. So we have 20 grams. This is our dose. Now we need to measure our yield. You saw me do this before. Very gently put this into the espresso machine. And this is where we can program our espresso machine. And it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video to teach everybody how to program their machine specifically. But maybe if I zoom right in, maybe I can show you. Yeah, cool. This is a pretty standard looking, very standard looking machine. And over on one side, we will have a button that is usually the continuous brewing button. This button here, if you press it, the espresso machine will just pour water out of the machine. So this is the continuous button. If you hold this button down, the continuous button, the machine will enter programming mode, and then you can pick any one of these buttons to program. So if we hold this down, we can then press this button when we want it to start, and then press it again when we want it to stop. And by using a set of scales down there in the drip tray, if we hold this button down, we press start on the button that we want to program, and we have a cup under here, and we're measuring the amount of coffee that's going into it with a set of scales. And when we hit 4, well, it's like, depending on how quickly your shot is brewing, at like 35, 38 grams, stop the process. Now, obviously, like I said, this is beyond the scope of this video to teach everybody how to program their machines. You will be able to find videos on how to program your specific machine on YouTube, I guarantee it. But the keypad here is kind of universal. Hold down the continuous button and then pick the button that you want to program. And here's what I think about these keypads. We will notice the coffee industry is moving away. We don't really use a different button to make different drinks. We don't do that anymore. Instead, we use one button to give us one standard recipe, and then we make distributions of that recipe to different sizes. To give you an example, using a set of portafilter over here that has spouts, let's zoom in on that. Whoop. So we've got a portafilter here. For a small latte, we would catch half of the brew. For a medium latte, we would catch 2 shots of the brew, and for a large, we would give them 2 and then reset the handle and then give them a third. So the way to think about it is that each time we brew, we'll go this way. Each time we brew, the way to think about it is each time we brew, we are making 2 espressos. That's what I made over here before, a double espresso. So what you'll notice then is that I'm just making exactly the same recipe and distributing it to different people in a different amount. If you get a small, you get 20 grams of espresso liquid. If you're getting a medium, you're getting 40 grams of espresso liquid. If you're getting a large, you will be getting 60 grams of espresso liquid. That is the process. And we are using exactly the same ratio of water to coffee to give to those people. We're not just using 20 grams of coffee and then adding more water or using less water based on the size of their drink. That doesn't make sense. So if you want to do it that way, be my guest that if that is how your customers enjoy their coffee, it's far from my responsibility to tell you how to make your customers their coffee. But however, I'm just explaining to you so that you've got an informed decision to make here about the way that you make coffee for your customers. The way that I have just described here is the industry standard way of doing things now. So that means that we can actually program any one of these buttons to give us any amount of water. So what I like to do is I like to pick the double small button and program that for a double espresso. But if this keypad wore out, you could totally program any one of the other keys, any one of the keypad buttons here, to be the button that you press to dispense the water that you use. So by putting some fresh coffee into the basket, putting a cup underneath it, having your set of scales turned on, turning on the continuous mode, holding it down until it starts flashing, and then starting the program and then stopping the program, you can program your espresso machine. Does that make sense? So now that we have 20 grams of coffee coming out of our grinder and we have the prerequisite amount of water to make a 40-gram drink, we can now start mucking around with our grind size. And that's what the collar on top of the grinder is for. Now you probably already know this. This shouldn't be news to you. Let me fix that focus. Whoa. There we go. This collar. This little collar here, this little collar on the top, this is how we adjust our grind size. You will see they usually have a sticker on it. Mine has a sticker right here that says coarser and finer. Yeah? So, provided you are using 20 grams of coffee in the basket, if you grind finer, your shots will take longer to brew. That is because the machine is fighting harder to force the coffee through the little fragments. Now, one of the roasters I used to work with, Tom, he used to use an example of, imagine a bucket full of sand and a bucket full of pebbles. It would take a lot longer for the water in the bucket of the sand to reach the bottom because it's got to pass through more. Same thing, there's more restriction, more resistance. Same thing to think about here. So why does it matter how long it takes for our coffee to brew? If we underbrew our coffee, if we don't let it brew for long enough, we will typically get a lot of sour flavors. Acid, coffee is a fruit and it has acid in it. Acid tends to dissolve more easily than sugars and fats. So if we don't let the brew, if we don't allow the coffee to brew long enough, then our drink is going to be thin and sour and kind of lack flavor. Alternatively, if we let our coffee brew too long, it will start to become quite bitter and powdery. I notice overbrewed coffee most in the aftertaste. So after I've taken a sip, put the cup down, then you start to notice the powdery texture on your palate. That is typically a coffee that has not been brewed for long enough. So that has typically brewed for too long because we've dissolved all of the compounds that make it taste really bitter. So we need to control our grind size with this collar. And you can now understand why not using a set of scales is going to make it very hard for you to identify if your shots are too fast because there wasn't enough coffee in the basket, or if because the particles were the wrong size. It's hard to tell if you don't have a set of scales. But if you know for a fact that there is a set amount of coffee in the basket, in this case we're using 20 grams, if you know that there's a set amount in the basket, then you know that it must be because the grind size is wrong. Oh, also, you've got to make sure that the amount of espresso is the same. So if you know that the dose is the same and the yield is the same, like there's not something going wrong with your espresso machine where it gives you 40 grams one time and then 60 grams another time, because that can be a thing, that can happen. So provided your espresso machine is programmed correctly and you're using 20 grams of coffee, then it must be the grind size. And so then we can simply come in here and make a slight adjustment. Now I'll zoom us right in. I'll zoom us right in and we will make a small adjustment. You may not have even been able to see that. I made a tiny adjustment. If you can see the little ridges here on the little notches on the collar, I moved it like one notch. I moved it a very, very short distance. And that's because we're only, let's zoom you back out. That's because we are only 5 seconds outside of our window. Small adjustment. I will make a coffee and start to see how long it takes for that adjustment to take place and how long it takes for that adjustment to shift, how long it takes for our espresso to brew. Now, if we were being like really pedantic, let me give you an example. Let's say, if I had a customer walk in now and they were going to potentially be a wholesale client of mine, then I would want my coffee to taste bang on delicious. And so I would probably throw the next 2 shots out. And that's because, and you probably can't see it from this angle, but the way that coffee grinders are designed is that there is actually a chamber inside here that gets filled with coffee grind before it gets flicked out of the grinder and into your basket. Yeah? And that chamber, we call how big that chamber is the retention. Yeah? The more coffee that a grinder holds onto, the more retention it has. Obviously, we want grinders that have very little retention. Less retention is better. So If you want to see an immediate change, well, there's all of this coffee inside the grinder here that is the old grind size. So that means that if we want to see a change in our flow rate, we need to throw that coffee out. Now, I'm not encouraging you to waste coffee. I never want people to waste coffee. It is hard to grow, it's hard to roast, and it's expensive. Don't waste it. Unless your recipe is well and truly out of whack. Yeah? Then sure, maybe you need to address that. So to get rid of the coffee, we will purge 2 shots. Again, I don't want to encourage wastage, but for the sake of this scenario, I've got somebody in and I have to make them a world-class espresso right now. This is how I'll do it. So we got a 35-second shot before. I did taste it. It's a little bit powdery. I'd like to get rid of that. Great. And now we will go again and start the process all over using our technique. We will add 20 grams of coffee to the basket. We will yield 40 grams of espresso using a set of scales if we have time, or we at least know how to program our espresso machine. Lastly, we will use a timer to control how long it took for that shot to brew. And let's say for argument's sake, this next shot comes out in 33 seconds. Cool, we know we're heading in the right direction. We can purge more, or we can serve the next couple of customers the shots, and we'll slowly make a little adjustment to our collar to try to bring our coffee back in line with 30 seconds. 20 grams in the basket, 40 grams of espresso should take 30 seconds to brew. That's the rule. And of course, you should taste it. You don't have to necessarily drink it, you can spit it out, but try tasting your coffee. If you think your coffee tastes good at 35 seconds, great, serve it, totally up to you. If you think your coffee tastes great at 25 seconds, great, serve it. You are responsible for, you are the last line of defense against bad coffee, but you do have to taste it. And you do have to try testing to see if it gets better if you brew it for a little bit longer or for a little bit shorter and bring it back in line with the recipe that I've told you. We have covered a lot. So we have covered some of the basic techniques of making sure that our coffee is set up correctly. And then we understand how this system is kind of linked. And you can program your grinder, by the way, just as I go back and think about this. We programmed our espresso machine, but we can also program our grinder. My grinder, this one here, is totally old school and it's manual and I can't program it. However, grinders like this one, you can press and hold the menu button and change how long they grind for. The longer they grind for, the more coffee that's going to come out. So if you need to adjust 20 gram, or let's say it's giving you 22 and you need to adjust it down to be 20, you need to set the timer on that grinder to be less. It's beyond the scope of this video to tell you how to program every grinder on the market, but it's usually that kind of concept. Enter a menu, select one of the programs, and then change how long that program runs for. Does that make sense? I don't know, I'm asking, you can't reply, can you? Cool. So we now have 20 grams in the basket. We have put it into the espresso machine. It made us 40 grams, and that took 30 seconds. This is awesome. We have a great tasting espresso, and we did the whole thing with great technique. This is vital. This is going to make great tasting espresso, and it's going to mean that your customers return. They keep coming back. So let's talk about a couple of issues you may still be encountering. There's a couple of things that you could be experiencing right now. You're like, I've done everything that you just said, Brian, and my coffee is all over the place still. So there's a couple of things. The first thing, the major thing to think about is a concept called channeling, which is kind of pretty obvious. If a crack or a fracture opens up in our coffee bed, the water is going to flow through that unevenly. Fractures or channeling happens because our coffee is very clumpy. Channeling happens because our distribution was not very good. Channeling happens if we don't tamp correctly. Channeling happens if we're too rough and smack the handle into the espresso machine. So if we do all of those things really well, then there is a good chance that you won't have channeling. That's why it's important to have good technique. Good technique is vital for getting no channeling happening, because channeling is inconsistent. It's very hard to channel 2 shots the same way, right? So it's important that we focus on the process, the technique of distribution and tamping and then putting it into the espresso machine correctly so that we don't get channeling. One of the other things that I have seen is around automatic tampers. If you have an automated tamper, have a look at it and see if it's actually tamping straight. Sometimes they tamp unevenly, or you'll notice that the handle sort of jolts when the head comes down and tamps. If that's happening, then your automatic tamper needs to be adjusted. Your handle shouldn't move when it's in the tamper. This is important. You can imagine if the handle's jolting as the tamper's going into it, well, then you're going to get an uneven coffee bed. Or if the handle's sitting on an angle when the tamper goes into it, then that's going to give you an uneven bed too. Does that make sense? So, set your dose correctly, learn how to program your grinder. Set your grind size correctly and set your yield correctly. Use a set of scales and a timer to control this process. 20 grams of coffee in the basket. It should make 40 grams of espresso in 30 seconds. You can program your espresso machine by holding down the continuous button. If you get the handle, you put the coffee into the espresso machine, hold down your continuous button with a set of scales and weigh the coffee and stop it at 40 grams, let's call it 38 so the last few drips can dribble out, then you're going to be able to program the head correctly. Typically when you're programming an espresso machine, the far left head is called the master, and all of the other heads are the slave. So if you program the far left head, it will typically program all of the heads the same. However, you've got to go in and double check that they are all actually accurate. Even if they've been programmed the same, they might be giving slightly different amounts of water. So you can go in if you want to and fine tune these heads and finesse it by programming each head individually. You can do that too. I hope this gives some baseline. We covered a lot, but this is the basics of great espresso. The base level, the baseline. You should be drinking your espresso. You should be focusing on your technique. You should be paying attention to the recipe that you're using by using a set of scales and a timer. You can get the scales from me if you need them, or get them from eBay, whatever. I hope this is useful. Of course, if you have any questions, get in touch and I will work to make sure that your espresso tastes great. Cheers.